This podcast contains explicit content and is intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Don't say we didn't warn you.
Hi, my name is Madison, and we don't have Hannah with us today. And you are listening to Who's Knocking, which is a true crime podcast. Welcome. So yes, Hannah is not here today, so it's just you and me. It's still gonna be fine. We're gonna do it. Okay, so this week, for those of you who don't know, I run this podcast, but I also have a weekly true crime newsletter where I kind of curate true crime content that's been going on over the week. I give some recommendations for different podcasts, like specific episodes of series or books or whatever I'm thinking is good and worthy of listening to or reading or watching. A little bit of news, mishmash of some stuff all within the true crime genre, I guess. It's very new and it is evolving, so maybe when you're listening to this, it's something completely different. But anyway, it's called Grim Weekly. You can sign up for it at grimweekly.com. That's GRIM weekly.com. It is free. But anyway, last week, or my last issue, came during the same week that Adnan Syed was released from prison. And I was talking with one of our listeners who, shout out, we chat all the time, and he had some things to say that I thought it was quite a hot take, to be honest. I remember I listened to, I'm not like really well versed in that case. I would really like to be, but it's like there's so much information, and with doing a new episode every week, I just literally don't have time. But I had listened to Serial back in the day when everybody did, and came out of that really thinking, wow, he seems innocent. And then I knew, or like at least now I had learned about, the Undisclosed podcast and all these other things. Like Amy Berg did a documentary, and like Amy Berg did West of Memphis, which I if you listen to this podcast, I definitely think the West Memphis 3 are not only not guilty, but innocent. It's just my opinion. So there's a lot of, it's to me, it was like there's a lot of people that are invested in this case pretty heavily, that I think are pretty trustworthy, that, who think that Adnan is innocent. But I've come to learn that there's actually like a pretty large amount of people who think that, I think it's pretty indisputable that they did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he is guilty. That I think most people can agree on. Probably there are people that don't agree on that. But there are quite a few people who do think that it's probable that he is guilty. And I'm so interested in that opinion because it's not what I lean towards. So please hit me up with, if that is your opinion, please tell me why. Like what evidence, like what do you not buy into? What do you buy into? Why is it that you think he killed Heyman Lee? I am fascinated, curious. And I just hope too that, anybody who's interacted with me or Hannah or whatever, like we say a lot of shit on this podcast. We throw a lot of opinions out there. We are not experts. We're just regular people. So I'm sure a lot of the time we are probably wrong. Please tell us when you're wrong. Tell us when you disagree with us. I consider myself a very reasonable person, and I am just more so curious to see why people come to these conclusions, because there's so much information out there on all of these different cases. There is so much, and I'm sure a lot of it is noise. And I think it's really hard sometimes to wade through and decide what to believe and what not to believe in. It a lot of the time comes down to opinion or gut or whatever. So, like for example, when we did the Jeffrey McDonald case, I think that one got like pretty controversial because like, I think the general consensus is that everyone thinks he's guilty. And I think we leaned a little bit more toward like the middle, or like not you know, we weren't so like, he's definitely guilty. So I think that it's so interesting to listen to other people and understand why they come to these conclusions. And I think some people, it's like, I just feel that way, or like something about this case rubbed me the wrong way or whatever. And then some people have like, no, this evidence and this evidence and this evidence doesn't make sense, and it doesn't it doesn't conclude A, B, or C or whatever. So please never be afraid to disagree with me. I love it. But I'm not looking to fight with anyone, but I'm curious. It all comes from curiosity. So yeah, please sign up for my newsletter, grimweekly.com, if you're interested. Anyway, today I'm going to get into a case. I think this is a pretty popular case. I've come across this case many times, many times in my true crime life, which, by the way, started in, I think I started getting into true crime when I was in grade 11, maybe 12. So it's like 16. And I'm now 28, nearly 29, Jesus Christ. So it's been a while. But this is the story of John Robinson Sr. This is John Robinson Sr. I think there is a junior. So this person is considered the internet's first serial killer. I doubt that's like, I don't know if that's like literally true, but that's what he is called. He's also called the slave master. Gag. That's fucking nasty. So this is John Edward Robinson Sr., and I'm going to just get right into it. So John Edward Robinson was born on December 27th in 1943 in Cicero, Illinois, which is Illinois, right? Which is a suburb of Chicago. His parents were Henry Robinson and Alberta Robinson. Henry was a mechanist, and Alberta was a stay-at-home mother. They had 5 children, and John was smack dab in the middle, number 3. Henry was allegedly an alcoholic, and Alberta apparently was a very strict disciplinarian. So there's really not a whole lot about his childhood. There's a couple things, but it did seem like he had a relatively normal childhood, I guess you could say. We know that his mother was very strict, so I don't know if she was strict in a good way or strict in a bad way. But the father was an alcoholic, so I think we can assume at minimum there must have been at least some abuse or neglect from the father. I would think with a strict disciplinarian and with an alcoholic, I'm going to go ahead and say that it's likely that there was some, physical abuse and maybe a bit of neglect. That's a guess, absolutely. And part of that guess is based on how the guy turns out. But yeah, a big part of John's childhood was spent in the Boy Scouts. And he like really worked his way up in the Boy Scouts and did very well. And by 1957, at age 13, he was named an Eagle Scout. And I did also read that he was a part of like the big Boy Scout or whatever. And like there was some sort of group that was going to present or do something for the Queen. And he was the only American boy chosen to be in that group to do something for the Queen. Little fun fact, my mother, shout out Margot, my mom, she, as a child, played the ukulele, and one time played the ukulele for the Queen, R.I.P. So now anyway, so we'll get into a lot of the crimes that John was involved in, and it kind of like started and then escalated as it does. But many people kind of wonder where this came from, all the crime, and it's mostly unknown. But what we do know for a fact is that Cicero at the time was the home to a lot of organized crime. Al Capone actually had his headquarters in Cicero, actually only a few blocks away from John's home. Now, Al Capone was dead by the time John was born, but I think that it's very possible, and I think it like is definitely true, that his legacy and like the organized crime or in the neighborhood and whatever still carried on to that time. So I think it's logical to conclude that John may have crossed paths with some organized crime people. Yeah, I think it's definitely possible that he knew or knew of some organized crime gangster type guys. I'm really thinking of, what's the freaking movie called? What is it? The movie. Ever since I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster. You know, fucking thing. Okay, whatever. Anyway, again, this is a guess. This is just people putting things together, you know, whatever. So when John was 14, John was attending a private Catholic school that prepared boys for priesthood. And he originally did plan to go that route to become a priest, which is hilarious when you see what he becomes later. Not hilarious, actually, very sad, but whatever. Now, John did graduate from this priest school, but by that time, he no longer wanted to be a priest. John then went to a local college and took classes to become an X-ray tech, but he dropped out only 2 years into his program and didn't finish. John, you see, was not a very hard worker, except when it came to figuring out how to avoid any type of work at all. It's so fascinating. I find there's a lot of these people, I think that you find, and it's like, they're so freaking lazy, but then like to keep up being lazy, they put so much effort into, you know, avoiding things and lying and doing this and that. And it's like, why don't you just work hard at the first thing in the first place, you know? But anywho, this was John. So even though John did not graduate and so was unqualified, he just lied about everything and forged documentation saying that he was qualified to become an X-ray tech, and he became an X-ray tech. When John was 21, he married a woman named Nancy Jo Lynch, and they settled in Kansas City, Missouri, and they had 3 kids together. And so they started what seemed like a very normal, average family life in Kansas City, Missouri. And in 1966, now John is working, 1966, John is working as an X-ray tech at a company or at a laboratory or whatever. And he was fired from this job. But then he found a similar medical job from which, and at this job, he started stealing from them. He stole actually tens of thousands of dollars. He also had sex with a bunch of the staff and patients behind Nancy's back. And he was caught among doing all of this. And he convinced them not to call the police if he paid back all the money. And so he essentially just got away with this behavior. So he and his family were now living in Kansas City, and then John secured himself a job at a pediatric hospital performing x-rays on children. Remember, this man is very unqualified for this job. But when it became clear that he had no idea what he was doing, John was fired, luckily. But then it was not too long before he found yet another x-ray tech job, and this time it was at a private practice. So in 1969, while working at this private practice, John got arrested for embezzling over $100,000 from his employer. And this was Fountain Plaza X-ray Laboratory. For this, he received a suspended sentence for embezzling only $33,000 because at the time that was all that they could prove. They knew that he had stolen about $100,000 because it was $100,000 was missing, but for whatever reason, they could only prove $33,000. And so he got a suspended sentence, which means he didn't have to actually serve any jail time, and he was placed on 3 years probation. So basically no punishment. John continued to embezzle and commit fraud from various employers with not a care in the world while on probation. John then decided to start his own company, and he thought of the very creative name Professional Services Association, which sounds very professional and very real. The company was just himself, and he said that he was a financial consultant specializing in the medical industry. So as he started this, a few hospitals nearly took on his services, but they very quickly figured out that John was full of shit and, didn't follow through. When his shitty made-up company failed to make any money, John decided to commit some more fraud instead. So what he did was he forged some letters written by some other companies that he made up, or real companies, but he forged the letters. One being a pharmaceutical distributor, saying that they were interested in buying his company. He then took these letters and showed them to people that he was hoping would invest in Professional Services Association to prove that things were legit, and offered to sell them stocks in PSA before the takeover, guaranteeing them a bunch of money. And that, my friends, is what we call securities fraud. And it was not long before somebody caught on and reported John. So then the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission ended up investigating John, and they charged him with 4 counts of securities fraud, mail fraud, and false representation. For this, he was fined $2,500 and placed on another 3 years of probation. So again, basically 0 consequences, another very light slap on the wrist. So here's what I'm saying about all of this, this is not organized crime. This is not like being a gangster, but this is like fraud. It is like well thought out, an individual committing all these crimes and embezzling and blah, 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 whatever. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but this is what he was into. Just being a fucking fraudster instead of trying to do anything legitimately. So then, in 1977, John got himself onto a board of directors for a local charitable organization. You see, John is interested in improving his reputation. So he'd been caught a number of times committing fraud and embezzling money and such. And so I think he was like, I need to spruce up my rep a little bit so people don't think I'm such a criminal, because, you lose trust in somebody doing that kind of stuff. So he got on this board of directors, and he did what he is best at. Instead of actually working and contributing to the charity, he instead forged a series of letters and documents from the, I'm air quoting here, executive director to the mayor of the Kansas City. And he invented an award and had himself named as Man of the Year at an award ceremony that he threw in his own honor. Cool. And then in 1979, John was finally released from parole. He then got a job at a place called Guy's Foods, which I think it was a company that manufactured and sold snack foods to restaurants and stuff like that. And he got a job there as the employee relations manager. While there, John started inventing fake employees and having their salaries go right to him. And he also started having an affair with one of the secretaries. Now, this affair, we allege, is probably to get information through her to help with the scheme. And now, as it usually goes, this woman started to really like John, God knows why. And she asked him to leave his wife, which I'm sure he probably promised her he would do because he's a fucking psychopath. But he then refused, and so she reported him for the whole scheme that he was running of the fake employees. So then there was yet another investigation. They found out that John had opened a corporate account under Guy's Foods' name and had used it to steal over $8,000. And he also wrote himself $20,000 worth of checks that went directly to himself. Again, John received, and this was his biggest punishment so far, but 64 days in jail. That was his sentence, and some probation. Which, man, this guy is not learning his lesson. I don't know how many times you have to be caught stealing thousands and thousands of dollars from people before somebody actually does something, but yeah, nothing. So this is where he's at. He's got a 64-day jail sentence, and yeah. So when John finished his 64 days, he was out on parole and he started yet another business. This one was called Equiplus, and it was a, quote, venture capital company. And after that, I guess that didn't really do much, but then he started what was called Equi2, which was a management consultant firm. And neither of these companies were doing much of anything, but you will hear about Equi2 soon. So we've established that John is a career criminal. He's got a family and a wife, and he just cheats on his wife constantly. And none of his schemes really have worked out because he's kind of gotten caught for all of them. But that's not the worst of John. He's a much, much worse guy than that. Okay, so here we're going to meet Lisa Stacy. And she is one of the primary characters in this story. So, it is January 12th, 1985, and a woman in Overland Park, Kansas, called the police to report her sister, Lisa Stacy, and her daughter, Tiffany, who's 4 months old, missing. Lisa was 20 years old at the time. She was born in Huntsville, Alabama, and had a pretty tragic childhood due to the deaths of both her father and her brother when she was quite young. So she really struggled in her youth. She dropped out of school at age 17, and she moved to Kansas alone to start over. She moved in with a local bartender named Kathy, who kind of took Lisa on under her wing after she met Lisa at the bar that Kathy worked at. And she kind of brought her into her little friend group, and they kind of all hung out at the bar. And despite the fact that Lisa was underage, Lisa became pregnant pretty quickly by a man named Carl Stacy. After finding out that she was pregnant, the couple quickly decided to get married. And then in September of 1984, she gave birth to her daughter, Tiffany. So the marriage quickly became physically abusive, unfortunately, and it did not last long. After it ended, Lisa, although it is good that it ended, right? She got out of it. But Lisa would end up in a women's shelter with her daughter, and Carl went off to work in the Navy, which he had been doing before. So Lisa was now alone with Tiffany, but desperately wanted to improve her situation. It seemed like an absolute stroke of luck when someone from the shelter told Lisa of an opportunity to join a new outreach program. This program offered a home to Lisa, an apartment, and Tiffany for free. It would provide free childcare and classes in a screen printing program, which is what Lisa wanted to get into, and also gave her an $800 per month stipend, and promised that after she completed her courses, they would help her find a job. So, wow, like what a program, Lisa thought. Like, what, just my luck? I can't believe it. That's amazing. Remember, folks, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And this is an instance where it was. So the man behind the program, his name was John Osborne. And he personally came to pick up Lisa and Tiffany from Lisa's sister-in-law and her husband, Kathy and David. This is another Kathy. She was staying with them, and so he came to pick the girls up. On the trip, John spoke with Lisa extensively about her life, and he took in every detail, and she kind of told him her whole life story. Lisa was very open, and she clearly divulged a lot of personal information. John told Lisa that they could come back in a few days and get the rest of her things. Lisa made a phone call to her mother-in-law, Betty, that evening, and she was frantic, asking why she was trying to get custody of Tiffany. And Betty was super confused because she was not doing this. But Lisa told Betty that she had been shown some signed affidavits showing that Betty was trying to gain custody of Tiffany. Blah, blah, blah. Lisa also told Betty that she had signed multiple blank sheets of paper And so like she'd been given sheets of paper and she'd signed her name at the bottom of these blank sheets of paper. And that they were taken by them. She did not clarify who them was. And then she said, quote, "They're here, I can't talk," end quote, and hung up the phone. And that's the last anyone has ever heard from Lisa. Now, Lisa's in-laws were very spooked by this phone call, and it concerned them greatly. So they called the hotel and tried to find her, but they were told that she had checked out. They found out that her room had been rented to a man named John Robinson with a credit card linked to a business called Equa2. They found the Equa2 office and they tried to locate this John Robinson. But when they asked about him, they asked this young man in the office, and the young man looked to be in his 20s, and they never got his name, but he told them that you have to leave. So Kathy and David later found a voicemail on their answering machine from someone called Father Martin from the City Union Mission. He left his phone number and said that Lisa and Tiffany were fine, but they had left with a man named Bill. And they found out later that this number for this Father Martin was not a number that was in service, and that City Union Mission also didn't know any Father Martin. Then Betty received a typewritten letter in the mail with Lisa's signature at the bottom. She was super suspicious right away, not only because of all the other suspicious shit going on, but because Lisa didn't really know how to use a typewriter. Betty knew she definitely would have handwritten a letter if she was going to write a letter, and also she remembered what Lisa told her about signing a bunch of blank sheets of paper. This letter thanked Betty for everything and said that Lisa was leaving Kansas City to start over somewhere, and that she would let Carl know how to reach her. So suspicious as fuck. When the police got involved, because they obviously went to the police, they very quickly hit a brick wall. They interviewed this John character who had driven Lisa, but he said that when he dropped her off, she had met up with a man named Bill, who she had gotten together with, and they had plans to go run off with him and start a new life. So John then mentioned that Lisa had come to his office before she took off and thanked him for all that he'd done for her. But she was very confident that this relationship would help sort out her life and that she didn't need the program. And this also corroborated the Bill story that came from Father Martin, even though we know Father Martin wasn't real, or at least his phone number wasn't real. So sketchy, sketchy, sketchy. And I don't know why the police weren't like, this John guy sounds like a complete, his story is not really checking out, because the Bill story doesn't check out. But that's where they kind of ended things. And they were like, Lisa is a grown woman. If she wanted to go off with this Bill character who's been mentioned now from 2 different people, she's allowed to. Does not sound like the best police work to me, but that's what happened. Now, meanwhile, and this is a situation. Now, meanwhile, back in John Robinson's real life, if you're not understanding, John Robinson is John Osborne. He was out here doing God's work. You see, his brother Dan and his wife Helen had struggled with infertility, and later with adoption. John Robinson had a solution for the loving couple who were desperate to have a child. You see, John, being the scam artist that he was, saw an opportunity to make some money while just desecrating other people's lives. He actually sought out Lisa after looking for a down-and-out mother with a baby. He made up this employment opportunity to lure her in, and when he got her into the hotel room, he forced her to sign adoption papers for Tiffany before he got rid of Lisa. Then John called up Dan and told him he had a new baby, that he knew of a baby who was available for adoption. The mother had just recently committed suicide. What a sad tale. John very convincingly told Dan that for the low price of $5,500 in legal fees, the couple could adopt this little baby who desperately needed a home. Dan and Helen were overjoyed to finally start a family of their own. So John sent over some very official looking paperwork with signatures of 2 lawyers and a judge, and that was that. On January 11th, 1985, John Robinson met Dan and Helen at the Kansas City International Airport to personally deliver their new baby. Sick. So, back to the investigation. The police, as I said, had no real leads and no indication anything illegal had taken place. As I said, not against the law for a grown woman to go out on her own. But there was one officer who was kind of disturbed by the whole situation because the story reminded him a lot of this other missing persons case. And this was the case of Paula Godfrey. It was only a few months earlier that they had received a call from Paula's father named Bill Godfrey, another Bill. So Paula was born June 19th, 1965, just outside of Kansas City. Paula was a figure skater, and she was a pretty good figure skater. She was trying to go professional, and she was looking for some part-time work on the side while she worked on her figure skating career. So she responded to an ad for a secretarial position at a company called Equa 2. Paula had a successful interview and secured the job. Paula's mother said that her new boss, John Robinson, told them that he would be flying out all the new employees to San Antonio to take a course in clerical work. Now, John came to pick up Paula on September 1st, 1984, to take her to the airport, and her family never saw or heard from her again. Really heard from her. After 4 days of not hearing from his daughter, Bill flew out to San Antonio to look for Paula. This is not a man who you should be stealing your daughter from because he gives a shit. He went to the hotel that Paula was supposed to be staying at, and turns out Paula had never been there. When Bill got back, he immediately reported Paula as missing to the police, and he went over to the Equa 2 office. He found John there, and Bill told him that he better hear from Paula within the next few days or else. Luckily for John, Bill did receive a letter from Paula after only a few days. The letter was very similar to the one that was from Lisa. This letter explained that she needed some time away from her family. This letter was handwritten and not typed, but the family did not think that it sounded like Paula, so they brought this letter to the police. Then they received another letter from, air quotes, Paula, which further reiterated that she did not want to see them. The family knew that these letters were not from Paula, but like in the Lisa Stacy case, there was very little that the police claimed that they could do. So that case kind of went cold. And that was before Lisa. So then this detective who was then working on Lisa's case was like, oh, that sounds really familiar. Also, same John guy. Then we also meet Catherine Clampett. On June 15th, 1987, Robert Bales reported his adopted sister, 27-year-old Catherine Clampett, missing. Catherine was born on May 29, 1960, and she was born in Korea. And she was later adopted by an American family in Wichita Falls, Texas. Catherine had moved to Overland Park, Kansas to live with her brother, Robert Bales, in an attempt to clean up her life a little bit. You see, Catherine had been involved in drugs and partying, and, she was kind of getting a little out of hand, and she was over it. So she was looking for a fresh start. Catherine had a 1-year-old son who she left in Texas with her parents. When she got to Kansas, she started looking for employment, and she quickly found an executive assistant position for a CEO. And can you guess which company? Siren. Ding, ding, you got it. It was Equa 2. Catherine's new boss, John Dawson, explained that part of her job would be flying around the country with John, and being his assistant, which sounded like a pretty fun opportunity. You get to travel. Nice. Catherine left on her first trip with John, and a few months into their trip, Catherine was never seen again. Catherine's mother so she'd gone on a couple trips and come back, and they'd be like, oh, cool, it was a real job. But then a few months in, it seemed like she was gone. Catherine's mother received a letter from Catherine that she was immediately suspicious of. She didn't think it sounded like Catherine at all. And since that was the only communication she'd received from Catherine, her mother started to fear that something was wrong. Robert, the brother, called the Equatu office and asked to speak to John Dawson, but he was told that nobody with that name worked there. So Robert started going through Catherine's things, and he found a receipt for a hotel that she'd stayed at, and it was signed by a John Robinson, not John Dawson. He called the hotel and asked who paid for the room, and it was a company credit card from Equatu with the name John Dawson. Shout out to Robert. You are a super sleuth. Go, Robert. Then Robert went to the Equatu office only to find that it had been shut down because John had just been arrested for fraud and theft. Wow, this story is taking a turn. So it turned out that a few months back, John started getting charged for the ridiculous amount of criminal activity that he'd still been up to. He was charged for multiple counts of fraud and theft, and John finally got an actual sentence of 5 to 19 years. I think his past kind of caught up with him, and they, finally were like, okay, this guy's been in prison or has gotten probation a number of times, and he's still up to this shit. Let's give him a real sentence. During this time, the 3 missing women's cases did not get connected, and they all ran cold as there was no real evidence of foul play in any of them. The situation finally ruined John's family, and Nancy divorced John and sold their home. John began his prison sentence in Kansas in 1986, before Catherine's family had even reported her missing. He had to finish out his sentence in Missouri. John was released in 1993 after serving only 7 years. When John was in prison, he started having an affair with a prison librarian named Beverly Bonner. Not long after the start of that relationship, Beverly divorced her husband and received a little chunk of money during their settlement, and was receiving alimony from him. She then moved into a trailer, and when John got out of prison, he joined her there. And soon after the couple began living together, Beverly disappeared, never to be seen or heard from again. But Beverly was never reported missing, and the cases of Lisa, Paula, and Catherine had gone cold long ago. But then, in March of 2000, Dawn Trouten called the police to report her sister, Suzette Trouten, missing. Suzette Trouten was born April 13th, 1972, in Monroe, Michigan. Michelle suffered from depression from a young age following the divorce of her parents when she was just 11 years old. Her depression worsened severely post-high school after a particularly bad breakup. Suzette was in such a poor state that she actually attempted suicide by shooting herself in the stomach. And that she was unsuccessful, but she did end up surviving, and after that quick brush with death, she really committed herself to improving her life. Suzette began a nursing program and worked as a nurse's assistant to support herself as she studied to become an actual nurse. Now, in Suzette's free time, she was into a little something, a little BDSM, as one does. She began visiting online chat rooms dedicated to BDSM. Now, this is kind of during the start of chat rooms. This is, I don't know what year it was, but it's early days. So, just so you know. For those who don't know, BDSM stands for bondage and discipline, domination and submission, sadism and masochism. Fun stuff. A big part of BDSM in the real BDSM community is all consent based. Like BDSM, people who actually do BDSM, there's a lot of checks and balances, and everyone's there in a consensual manner, whatever. So just that is an important thing to say. But Suzette was into BDSM, and she really enjoyed being a submissive partner in relationships where she had somebody who was the dominant partner. So she went online to seek a dominant partner. And unfortunately for Suzette, this would prove to be a very bad move. So while in one of the chat rooms, Suzette came across a fellow with a screen name JR. JR and Suzette got to know each other, she ended up divulging a lot of information about her circumstances and really opening up to this JR person. And I bet you know who JR is. And JR went on to tell Suzette that he was a very wealthy businessman, LOL, and that he just happened to be looking for a live-in nurse to aid his elderly father. JR sweetened the deal by telling Suzette that this job that he was offering her would pay $65,000 a year, which, translated in today's dollars is a lot more. And she would also get an apartment of her own and a company car. This deal sounded too good to be true, because it was. Suzette was at least somewhat skeptical because she had asked to come to Kansas first to meet JR's dad before she accepted the job. Good move. JR agreed, and when she arrived, he made this big spectacle and made it a big whole thing. He picked her up from the airport in a limo. He brought her to this big house and said that it was his. It wasn't. And he also got someone to pretend to be his father and introduced Suzette to this imposter. And he also had multiple people playing his wife and a few other nurses that he said worked for them. And, this man went all out. Suzette was super impressed, especially after hearing from all these nurses who already worked for John, telling her what a great job it was. And they all, of course, had glowing things to say about him as an employer. So Suzette was satisfied. She had she'd done her due diligence and found this to be a wonderful opportunity. Of course, because why wouldn't she? Suzette went home. She packed up her stuff, her 2 Pekingese dogs, and headed to Kansas. There you go, Hannah. There are 2 dogs here. They do not die. Don't worry. It was not long before somebody found her 2 dogs wandering alone in the streets, and nobody knew where Suzette was. Then, of course, her family began to receive emails from Suzette. In her messages, she told them that she was going on a sailing trip and wouldn't have any service to contact them. How convenient. Suzette's mother, Carolyn, was immediately suspicious. She knew that these emails did not sound like Suzette at all, and she emailed back saying so. But then Suzette's mother got a call from this JR guy, and he told her that Suzette had actually gotten together with this man named Jim Turner, and that she had run off with him, leaving him high and dry, by the way, and actually accused Suzette of stealing money from him. Carolyn was not buying it at all, and the family got in contact with the police. Well, here was John's big fuck up. He had given Suzette and her mother his real name, John Robinson. So as soon as the police were informed, they pulled up his file and saw his recent prison time and the fact that he was questioned in all those old cold cases. And finally, somebody started putting all this shit together. So the police in Michigan started contacting all the detectives who were in charge of those other missing persons cases and trying to track down these missing women to see if they were still missing. They put John Robinson under surveillance and quickly discovered some of his very shady behavior. He had gotten back together with Nancy, and he and his family were living a very simple life in a trailer park, living just a regular family life. But during his spare time, they found out that he was meeting up with lots of women in seedy hotels, and essentially he was leading a double life. And they knew they had a bad guy on their hands. So the police started tapping John's phone and got subpoenas for his computer, which is where the real extent of his crimes were discovered. The beginning of things to be discovered. See, John had this freaky little online routine. He would meet a woman in these BDSM chat rooms, and he would get to know them, and then he would invite them to his place with an offer for a job. When the woman would arrive, he would engage them in a BDSM sub-dom relationship where he was the dom and they were the sub. And actually, most of these women were kind of into it anyway. I mean, they did meet in BDSM chat rooms, so it's not like out of left field. And some of them, he would just engage in these relationships and let them go. But others were not so lucky. The police spoke to a woman named Brenda who had had a run-in with John. She had met him as James Turner, and they had a consensual BDSM session at a hotel. But at some point during this meetup, the two got into an argument and James struck her very hard. She left the room, and on her way out, she asked the receptionist who the room, like the name that the room was under. And that's where she got the name John Robinson. And she went straight to the police. She was not having it. There was another woman who had almost the exact same complaint, but he, on top of assaulting her, he also robbed her. And she also reported it to the police. Not sure what her name was. So there's 2 instances of him assaulting women that in a situation that started as a consensual situation. In June, Suzette's family started receiving typed letters that had Suzette's written signature at the bottom. The letters were coming from Mexico. Yet another familiar farce. And we do know that John was one of his friend's moms was going on a trip to Mexico. So he's like, oh, can you just take these letters and mail them from Mexico for me? And she's like, yeah, sure. What a great guy. I'll of course do that favor for you. The letters said that she was happy and having a great time with her 2 dogs. And that was a huge giveaway because her family already knew that her dogs had been found. So there's like very obvious lie. But I guess John Robinson was unaware that the dogs had been found by the family. So after giving all this evidence to the DA decided that this was enough for an arrest warrant. They came for his home and they searched his home and seized a bunch of shit. While searching his home, they found out that John had 2 storage units and a farm property, which was just south of his main house. Or a trailer, because it was a trailer. So they got into one of the storage units, and detectives found a suitcase that contained Suzette's social security card, as well as her birth certificate and a passport application. There was also what they found to be a, quote, slave contract between Suzette and John Robinson. The contract stipulated that Suzette agreed to have John be her, quote, slave master. And that is why John Robinson is referred to as a slave master. Freaky deaky. Detectives also found a college ID card for a girl named Isabella Lucia. Yeah. There were also more blank pieces of paper with the written signatures of Suzette and Isabella, and there were envelopes with the addresses of their family members already written on the outsides. At this point, John was outright refusing to talk, and with a lack of bodies or any real physical evidence, John was only being charged with 2 counts of sexual battery and 1 count of theft from the 2 women who had run-ins with him. So John was sitting in jail, and he was unable to afford bail. Poor guy. Nancy was questioned, but to this day, there is no evidence that she had any idea what John was doing behind her back. But Nancy, you looked the other way for a lot of stuff, so I don't know. The most that she had to say was that she suspected he was having an affair, something he clearly did constantly to her, so not shocking. At this time, police went on to do a search of John's farm property, and they found a number of 88-gallon hazmat barrels. Yeesh. Inside one of the barrels, they found the body of Suzette Trouten. And in another barrel, they also found another body that was unidentifiable at the time, but was later identified as Isabella. So, a little bit about Isabella. She was born in Poland in 1978, and her parents were both scientists. The whole family moved to the U.S. in 1993, and they lived in West Fayette, Indiana. Isabella dreamed of becoming a fashion designer. She was super artsy, and she was attending Purdue University to do that. Like John's other victims, Isabella was inclined to participate in BDSM, and she was spending time in these BDSM chat rooms. She had a similar story to the others. In 1999, she left her home suddenly and moved to Kansas. Her parents received letters from her saying that she was traveling around the world. And this family apparently did think that the letters were genuine and checked out, and they didn't really question the whole thing. And that must have been, I don't think it was because her family didn't care about her. I think it's because probably maybe just by luck he ended up sounding like her, or that was something that maybe she wanted to do. So it wasn't out of the realm of possibility. When questioned, John said that he had never asked her to work for him, and said that Isabella had moved out there to surprise him. And now they did find records that the two had applied for a marriage license together. But since John was already married, he gave a different middle name and pretended to be a different guy. And on the license, Isabella claimed to be in her 30s, although she was not that old. All the efforts to lie, and nobody even came to pick up the marriage license. But this, I think it's possible, or what it's alluded to is that the relationship between John and Isabella started out as a consensual thing. I think it's very possible that he started having a relationship with her and she was like, either she found out that he had a wife or asked him to leave his wife or whatever, and then he didn't want to, and then he's just like, oh, I'll just kill her. Still tragic, still horrific. So the autopsies on the two women concluded that they both died of blunt force trauma to the head. Neither had any defensive wounds, which suggested that they'd been taken by surprise or perhaps were even sleeping at the time that they were attacked. Then the detectives went to go check the other storage units. These ones were in a different facility in a neighboring town, which is why it took a little bit more time to obtain a search warrant. But when they looked inside, they found more barrels. And inside the barrels were more bodies. There they found Beverly Bonner, who we knew as the prison librarian. But the other two bodies belonged to Sheila Faith and her daughter Debbie Faith, who was 15 years old and had cerebral palsy. More women. So Sheila was born in Dallas, Texas in 1948, and she was raised by her grandparents after her parents abandoned Sheila and her siblings. Then later, Sheila went on to have a daughter, Debbie, and Debbie suffered from cerebral palsy. And Debbie had a very outgoing personality that made her pretty popular among her peers. The family did not do very well financially, and so when John Faith, Sheila's husband, died of cancer, it put the family pretty much straight up into poverty. And I assume that the financial problem started with John's cancer and stuff like that. Seems to run people pretty dry. Now, despite all of their problems, Sheila, she was trying to do the best for her daughter and stuff and whatever, but she did take to the internet looking for companionship, which is where she very unfortunately crossed paths with John Robinson. Once John got to know Sheila and heard about her very tragic life, hearing about her recently deceased husband and her disabled daughter, instead of, being a regular ass person and being like, wow, that really sucks, he decided to offer to, quote, help her, just like he had the others. You see, he really wanted her monthly Social Security check. What a fucking scumbag. It was later discovered that the Social Security office had gotten a letter from a Dr. William Bonner claiming that Debbie's state was in decline and that she would need increased care for the rest of her life. This meant that she qualified for more money from Social Security. And if you didn't catch, William Bonner was Beverly's ex-husband. Sheila's Social Security checks were being sent to the same P.O. box that Beverly's alimony checks were being sent to. Can you fucking believe it? So this guy, he gets with this librarian, and then I don't know, who knows if he forced her to divorce this guy or knew that she wanted to divorce this guy, whatever. He's like, oh, alimony checks, dope. And then finds a woman who's struggling and has I don't know how severely, but somewhat disabled daughter who's getting Social Security checks, and I was like, oh, I'll send them to the same P.O. box. What if, that's just, what a scummy individual. This man clearly has no feelings, doesn't care for anybody, and is a complete psycho. But I digress. Let me go on. After searching the rest of his properties extensively, they found no other bodies. So John was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder. They had Suzette, Isabella, then they had Sheila and Debbie and Beverly. And they also were going for trying him for the murder of Lisa Stacy, even though they hadn't recovered her body. They decided to go for it. So he had to stand trial in both Kansas and Missouri, as some of the bodies were found in Kansas and some of them were found in Missouri. So first up was Kansas, where he was on trial for the murders of Lisa, Suzette, and Isabella. John pleaded not guilty, because of course he did, but the jury found him guilty on all 3 murders. John received a life sentence for the murder of Lisa and death sentences for the murders of Suzette and Isabella. Next up was Missouri, and John was offered a deal from the prosecutor. He would not seek the death penalty if he confessed to the murders of Paul Godfrey and Catherine Clampett. And I don't know why, but John agreed to the deal. And I mean, he's already got 2 death sentences, but he agrees to the deal. And then he confessed to being involved with their deaths, but he would not say where their bodies were. John then pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder and received 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. John remains on death row to this day, and the bodies of Lisa, Paula, and Catherine have never been found. So that's basically the end, but let us not forget about little Tiffany. So after all of this came out, Dawn and Helen began to suspect that their 15-year-old daughter, Heather, may in fact be Tiffany Stacy. And they were not wrong. See, Heather had been living an absolutely fine life with her very normal adoptive parents. And like here we see John was who I just described him to be. And his brother, Don, was like a perfectly normal guy who adopted this baby. Great dad. Heather had been living perfectly fine. And when everything was discovered, she actually opted to stay with her adoptive parents, Don and Helen. Her real father, Carl Stacy, who you remember from the beginning, he agreed to this arrangement, but did meet his daughter, and he was ultimately very happy to find her very alive and well after all of these years. But I think he kind of understood, like, these are the parents she grew up with, and she was happy being there, so he kind of let it be. And that's pretty much the story of John Robinson. I think it's a pretty horrific story. I would love to know, as we always do, a little bit more about his childhood and upbringing, and even like his other siblings. It looks like at least one of them turned out to be a pretty normal guy. But I do think it's interesting, a lot of these cases, especially during the origins of the internet and, before police were, this looks like, at least one guy ended up putting things together with these murders happening in different jurisdictions. But I think you see a lot of cases like that before police units were like talking to each other. It was much easier for serial killers to get around for a long time, even though he was choosing people he was flying people in and out of places, but like for a while it was like they were pretty close to each other. But yeah, it's yet another instance of, I'm air quoting here, but BDSM related stuff, which I think a lot of people in the actual BDSM community would say is not actually BDSM, because it's not. Once it becomes unconsensual, it's no longer BDSM. But it looks like he was in some consensual BDSM relationships. I think it's just, I don't even know if that's even related, or if that was just like an easy chat room to get into, and like the type of people who were looking to like meet up, and like, like that's more of the vessel rather than the reason. Who knows? And it's very unfortunate that they never found a bunch of the bodies, because their families never really get closure on that, and that fucking sucks. But yeah, I think next week, hopefully Hannah will listen to this and we can get her take on all of it. Hannah, by the way, because I know you'd ask, what happened to the 2 Pekingese dogs? I actually know what happened to the dogs. They were found and they went to the Humane Society, and they unfortunately were separated, but both sent to different, very loving owners. So that sucks, but is better than them being killed. Just saying. So yeah, that's another solo episode in the books. Let me know how I did as a solo host today. Please reach out if you would like to. We are on Instagram at Who's Knocking Podcast, Twitter at Who's Knocking Pod. You can email us hello@whosknockingpodcast.com. And please sign up for my newsletter. It is grimweekly.com, where you can sign up. And yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with it and would love any and all feedback. And that's all of our stuff. Please, folks, please, for the love of God, stay safe out there, because you never know who is knocking. This podcast is produced in collaboration with Lost Line Media. Artwork by August Digital. Music by Matthew Cook.